It's a bonus edition of the Book Club for Kids. Hi, I'm Kitty Felde. Last week we discussed Gina McMurchy-Barber's novel, The Jigsaw Puzzle King. But McMurchy-Barber didn't start out with the goal of being a writer of books for children.
I have a degree in archeology, and while I was earning my degree, I decided I wanted to write little stories for my local newspaper. And that worked out really well. And so when I finished my degree, I went into journalism and studied that for a while. I never imagined myself creative enough to be a story writer in the, fiction world. And when my children arrived, I started reading kids' books all the time, and I loved them. And so then I started to write, little short stories and tried that. Now, I wrote a short story called Reading the Bones, and it was an archaeology adventure story that I wrote for my class, because I'm also a teacher. And I wrote it for my kids in my class, and that became eventually my first novel. That's what led me into kids' books, and I love kids' books, and I love kid book writers. I find children's writers so approachable and humble and just generally very easygoing people.
Well, what's the writing community like in Canada?
Well, I'm connected to a number of writers. I belong to an organization in British Columbia where I live. And, I love, before, COVID-19, the get-togethers with people. And I loved, hearing about their ideas and what they're writing. And, it was a warm and happy community. And it's a very supportive community, I'd say.
Is there something you learned in archaeology that applies to writing?
That's a really good question. Both are very, slow, tedious processes, and would take great care, great research, and you need to really, it's a very, lonely work, because archaeologists work alone a lot of the time, and so do writers. So there's similarities in that way, I suppose. My first book that I wrote came out of an experience. I studied the human remains of a 3,000-year-old First Nations individual that came out of a rescue archaeology experience near the beach where I live. And it was at first, just an exciting, like, oh, look at this box of bones. I'm going to, it was almost like Lego or something. But I spent 3 months examining those bones, and eventually I started to realize, hey, this was a life. This was a real person. This is not a toy. These are the remains of somebody that mattered. And it really heightened my sensitivity, and that became, the foundation for my first book, was my character learning to become more respectful of these human remains, which are, in my area, not uncommon, because this is a 3,000-year-old Coast Salish dwelling, like their fishing village and their permanent dwelling was sort of in this area. So I gained a lot of respect during that experience, and that's what I wanted to convey in my story, my first book. So the archaeology certainly was an important experience, and that became the lesson.
You say you saw a story in those bones, and in many ways that's the way a writer has to think.
Well, yeah, there's always something that inspires us to tell a story, and in my case it was these human remains that, not so much the human remains, but the lesson that I learned by, respecting them better than I had when I started the process. You have to be very careful because, when you're writing, even when it's fiction, you have to be careful about what it is that you're saying. And in archaeology, you have to be very careful, because if you make a mistake, that information is lost. When you excavate remains or artifacts from the ground, you've essentially destroyed all the information around it. So you better get it right when you're doing it the first time. I suppose in that way, writing is easier because, with the computer, you can always go back and delete and improve and work it. And you don't have that option in archaeology.
You have the advantage of being surrounded by a classroom full of experts on children's literature. Are there some lessons that you can share for those of us who aren't teachers?
Well, kids in my class, and I'm sure beyond, they love a great adventure. And, kids' books in the last decade or more have become a lot more elaborate in terms of the kinds of experiences that children are exposed to. And like the Hunger Games, I'm thinking of Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief and those kinds of stories. There's high tension. There's often, very wicked characters and even death in those books. And those are not things of the old days. Now, those are not the kind of stories I tend to write. I'll share an example. My book was nominated for an award, and this was my first book, Reading the Bones, and it was nominated for an award in Ontario, and I got to fly out. And another writer that was nominated, her book was called The Third Eye. Well, as it turned out, that was the book that won, and my publisher gave me a copy of that book, and on the way home on the plane, I read that book. And it was gripping, and I couldn't stop reading. It was like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen next? Oh my God. And, there was, danger and death and destruction and, all of that in it. So when I got back to my class, they said, oh, did you win, Gina? And I said, no, I didn't win. But the book that won was really good and really exciting. And I told them about it. And the question was, well, why don't you write that kind of a book? So, it was a good question. On the other hand, it really boils down to your personality. And I think, not all writers, there is a good number of writers who are also teachers, but not all writers are teachers. And I have to say, I don't know how other teacher writers think, but I'm always thinking about a bigger objective, which is, what can I teach through my books?
Thanks, Gina. We have interviews with dozens of other writers at our website, bookclubforkids.org. That's also where you can find hundreds of book suggestions from the experts, other kids. And we are hard at work producing new Book Club for Kids episodes. And if you have a group of young readers who would like to be on the show, send us an email to kitty@bookclubforkids.org. We are also hard at work on Season 2 of our other podcast, The Fina Mendoza Mysteries. The show is cast, the script is finished, and we've actually started taping. So stay tuned for updates on The Fina Mendoza Mysteries. I'm Kitty Felde. Thanks so much for listening.